Most people's idea of a nuclear exchange is actually dated back to 1960s roughly. They have absolutely no idea about the technological advances that have taken place over the last 40, 50, 60 years. The technology is absolutely surreal. The first use of a nuclear weapon, it will break the ice. Other countries will essentially develop the attitude that if somebody else can use it, so can I. There's about 100 different steps that have to actually take place before a nuclear weapon is actually detonated. And if you can compromise the integrity of any one of those systems, you can reduce the lethality of that bomb. ICBMs that are in silos. If you possess enough knowledge, you can absolutely hack into that system. There's a term in the government for things that are funded behind back channels. It's called black funding. Russia, China, and America, we've had directed energy weapons for years. People are like a bunch of ostriches. They want to put their head in the sand and ignore something as long as it doesn't affect them directly. If the general people actually understood what was really going on, they would literally be up in arms.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Well, it's an honor today to have on the channel Castle Bravo. That's the alias. He's going by Castle Bravo. He is a telecommunications technician with a background in computer science and radio communications. He has a keen sense of interest in quantum mechanics and electromagnetic theory specific to radiated energy platforms such as radar and satellite communications. He's also studied various electronic surveillance and weapon systems specific to modern militaries, and he has over 20 years of experience in criminal justice and communication, and has a minor background in criminal psychology. So I'm sure we're going to have a lot to talk about today. That's what we call in the biz range. This guy has range. Also, I'm very impressed. We've had numerous email exchanges, and a lot of the insights you've provided me have been the basis of videos I've done. You've opened my eyes to a lot of things, and I was very impressed with your understanding of the more obscure and lesser known aspects of nuclear warfare. I mean, a lot of people just think, okay, you push a button and nukes fly, and that's the extent of it. That's like the average person's understanding of strategic warfare is the nukes just fly. But what people don't realize is that there's this whole intricate network of radio communications and auxiliary aspects to coordinating nuclear strikes, as well as just a much more complex strategic calculus that I think most people just don't have the bandwidth to fully appreciate. So I'm hoping that we're going to talk all about things like GPS jamming and electronic warfare and how satellites might factor into this and just how a nuclear war might play out. So welcome to the channel, and I'm going to hit you with a big question right off the start. It's not a big question in terms of how our conversations go, but how close do you think, knowing what we know, where we're at today, how close are we really, realistically, to a nuclear escalation in the numerous theaters of conflict around the world?
We're a lot closer than people think we are. And to add to that, we're not nearly as close as some people think we are as well. Prior to a nuclear exchange, you're going to see a lot of things take place. You're going to see mission creep push the narrative of both sides or all sides that are involved. You're going to see them push people over more and more red lines as the time goes on. And you're going to start to see things happen that should give you a clue that certain things are imminent. We have not quite gotten to that point yet. And a lot of people, they don't want to be confronted with the inconvenient truth of what's really going on around them. People are like a bunch of ostriches. They want to put their head in the sand and ignore something as long as it doesn't affect them directly. And that's where a lot of people are at today. They're not really paying attention. A lot of these things are going on in various different places of the world. Iran, Israel, China. A lot of people are being pushed over lines that they've drawn in the sand. So we're getting closer and closer to it every day, but I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow or maybe even next week.
And in terms of what are some of those warning signs that you think we would see in the run-up to?
You've already seen a lot of them. The severing of diplomatic ties is probably your number one red flag. This is essentially everybody standing up from the table saying, "I'm done talking to you." No more diplomatic relations, and if they are, they're going to be strained from that point forward. You're starting to see different countries pull out weapon systems, advanced weapon systems that they've been developing or that they've had behind a curtain somewhere for a number of years. You're seeing those come out right now, specifically like the Avant-Garde glide system that Putin has put into service with his submarine fleets. A lot of these things come to fruition as the mission creep gets closer and closer to an event delta, and we're seeing a lot more of that every day.
How do you think a nuclear war might play out? Like, if we're talking like from start to finish, is it just going to be? Do you think it would be a managed escalation, or do you think it would be once the first one is dropped, there's an immediate fast chain reaction that occurs, or is it going to be more gradual than some people think? Like, what could you maybe, among the many theaters where something could happen, where do you think it's most likely, and how do you think it would start?
Pick any one of the theaters that are currently hot right now. I'll just use Russia, for example. Again, these lines are being crossed daily. Somebody says or does something that irritates the other side, they get pushed a little further back into a corner. And in the beginning, right now, you're going to see a conventional response. You're going to see them try to keep the death toll down. You're going to try to keep the political channels open. But sooner or later, somebody, one side or the other, always feels like they're being pushed into a corner beyond a point where they can maintain a conventional response. And the first use of a nuclear weapon, regardless of which country uses it, it will break the ice. It will set a precedent where other countries will essentially develop the attitude that if somebody else can use it, so can I. And each subsequent use of a nuclear weapon after that, let's say it starts off as a simple short-range theater ballistic missile. An example of that would be like a Scud missile, something that's got less than 2,000 kilometers range. They put a small yield warhead on it, and they shoot it over a border, and it explodes in an opposing country's territory. After that, every subsequent use of a nuclear weapon becomes easier and easier and easier. I compare it to somebody exercising sin. The first time you do something, you know it's wrong, it's hard to do it, but every time that you do it after that, the conscionable choice to do it again and again gets easier and easier. In for a penny, in for a pound. And at some point in time, you're going to find yourself in a situation where they're going to escalate from a theater ballistic missile, short range, medium range, until you eventually do get to a point where they feel like they're going to have to use something to garner the attention of the entire world, essentially telling the entire world, hey, back off, we've had enough.
Wow. Yeah. I think your assessment there is definitely very close to what we might see. And you're 100% correct in that the exposure to the initial event, there'll be this period of excitement and panic that will surround the first use of a nuclear weapon. But we're seeing already how quickly people can adjust and get normalized to new levels of escalation. We've seen it throughout this last 2 years. You know, lines that we thought would never be overstepped are now being overstepped on a daily basis. I can just think of one thing, and that is targeted strikes deep inside of Russia, whether it's attacks on their critical infrastructure, attacks on the Kremlin, attacks into the more bordering regions like Belgorod and Bryansk. And these at one point would have elicited a global response and reaction, but nowadays you don't even hear about it on the news. So I'm with you when you're saying that the use of a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon, there will be this immediate, shock and awe, but I think it will be much more short-lived and probably a lot more short-lived than it would have been had it been done during the Cold War, because we're just so desensitized now to stuff. There's just so much information that, you know, it's so easy to just derail us and get us distracted thinking about something else, you know, because it's just one catastrophe after the other. So I think our becoming acclimatized to the use of weapons, nuclear weapons, is going to happen a lot quicker and easier than most people think.
I think you're absolutely right. The normalcy bias, I've heard you state that several times. The normalcy bias actually increases exponentially. The human body and the human mind is a very tricky animal. And once it experiences something and it gets over the initial grief cycle, the initial cycle of having to deal with it and come to terms with it, again, like the first use of a nuclear weapon, having to go through something like that again is so much easier. And every time we see something on the news, well, I saw that last week, it doesn't really surprise me. Or they're doing that again, well, we turn a cheek because everybody's tired of hearing about the same old thing. I can remember in the very beginning of the Ukraine conflict, seeing the first short videos of individuals on the front line. And I'm thinking, okay, yeah, this really parallels to what I saw in previous conflicts in Bosnia and Herzegovina and things of that nature. Whenever things went kinetic, and then today, that's all you see. If you go up on certain social media platforms, that's all you see is short videos or excerpts taken from videos showing the kinds of things that go on. And people are just absolutely desensitized to it. They're jaded to the idea of something important going on.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to almost have a conversation with you about, I know you have a background in criminal psychology, and just how that element might emerge in a post-collapse world as well. Maybe we'll have some time to get into that. But what do you think are some common misconceptions based on your individual studies with respect to nuclear warfare? What are some things that people might overlook or might not know about nuclear warfare from either a tactical or even a strategic point of view?
There's an old saying that the only stupid question is the one not asked. And a lot of people just don't know the right questions to ask. They don't have a frame of reference to properly look at something. Most people's idea of a nuclear exchange is actually dated back to post-World War II and the first generation of intercontinental ballistic missile technology, 1960s roughly. Whenever somebody envisions a nuclear weapon going off, the first thing that pops into their mind or some of the old footage that you may see that circulates around on the internet, they have absolutely no idea about the technological advances that have taken place over the last 40, 50, 60 years since that time that allows countries, even splinter factions, to be able to utilize that technology in such a way that absolutely does not compare to what some people fall back to whenever they envision something like that. The technology is absolutely surreal compared to what it was just 20 or 30 years ago, let alone in the 1950s or 60s. And a lot of people just don't understand what they're looking at. And because they don't understand it, they don't have the background in it. Again, they turn into that ostrich. They stick their head in the sand and they turn a cheek. They don't want to be inconvenienced by it.
Do you have any examples of that kind of technology that you're referring to?
Sure. First generation missiles. The first generation missile that we employed was really just a copy of the old Wunderwaffe V2 that Werner von Braun helped pioneer. And that is essentially what people envision in their mind. And it used a very old, very rudimentary inertial guidance system. And while modern ICBMs still use a version of that same inertial guidance system, there are certain enhancements to it that allow it to be a lot more accurate and a lot more lethal than it was 30 years ago.
So you're talking about like an intercontinental, just for people who don't know what we're talking about, you're talking about an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, that uses like basic rudimentary rocket science to There's no like onboard guidance system or anything?
There's an onboard guidance system. It uses things like gyroscopes and accelerometers to essentially, it knows kind of where it took off from, and it knows that it needs to be pointed in this particular direction and achieve a specific azimuth, which means angle pointed up into the air. And it needs to travel in that direction for a certain amount of time before it starts to achieve its apogee, which is the highest point that it gets, and then it's going to start to angle back down towards its target. Those systems, those early systems, they could have a mean error of anywhere between 2 to 10 kilometers. That's actually a pretty big, 1.2 to a little over 5 miles, over 6 miles. And the way that other countries combated this was to put a single large nuclear warhead on that missile, so they didn't really have to get as accurate in order for it to still have a profound effect at or near the target. You don't have to hit a bigger city directly in the very center of that city in order for it to have a damning effect on that city. You could be off by several kilometers and still achieve your result. Today, they use a much different approach. And a lot of people who don't know, they don't have the proper frame of reference and the background to understand what goes into a modern day intercontinental ballistic missile. They associate that old technology, the tried and true and proven inertial guidance systems. They don't have the frame of reference to understand that today those guidance systems can get that missile to within 50 meters of its target.
Wow.
It's a huge difference.
And so with that, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about this in terms of the going from the more analog-based technology that you're referring to that maybe can't be compromised by electronic warfare or EMF radiation, like electromagnetic pulse. We'll talk about your theory of utilizing EMPs against nuclear weapons, but there's a trade-off then, right? With the increased accuracy, you're also perhaps more vulnerable to countermeasures?
Absolutely. The older technology had very few internal electronic components. They still had a few, but it wasn't nearly as pervasive as they are today. And today you've got literally hundreds of different components that go into an ICBM. You've got GPS trackers, radio modems, radio altimeters, barometric altimeters, all of these things. Some of them even operate on an analog, but they may be connected to a multiplexer, which is essentially a central computing platform that develops a glide slope aspect so that it understands where it's at and what angle it needs to achieve in order to properly come in, re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, and detonate above or on a specific target. And all of these things are susceptible to EMF. EMF is electromagnetic force, and electricity and magnetism, although they're two different things, they're joined at the hip. And these things can have a profound effect on anything electronic. And that's where the trade-off comes at today. We can be a lot more accurate with them. We can be faster with them, but we've also got certain things that we have to protect against.
And so can it be shielded against that?
Absolutely. Every intercontinental ballistic missile is shielded. The proper term that's often used for is called hardened. It's hardened against an EMP attack or an EMP pulse. The problem is not all of it. It's not foolproof. It's not a guarantee. The average person, you mentioned EMP, and the first thing out of their mouth, they're going to say, oh, well, I'll throw my phone in a Faraday cage and it'll be okay. To a certain extent, possibly, but it's not a guarantee. There are certain things that exist in just about every facet of modern electronics that will allow even the most rigorously built Faraday cage to fail if it's not built properly or if it has certain exploitable things to it. One of the most prominent is what's called a barrier breach. Inside this missile, you have various different pipes, tunnels, conduits, and things where you're going to run your cables. And even though those cables may be shielded, a certain amount of these conduits, these holes, these pathways that the EMP can go from one compartment to another does not guarantee that just because you shielded something, that the whole of your product, the entirety of that missile, is shielded from an EMP pulse. They've tried several different things from voltage attenuators to RF chokes to even uh, fiber optics so that you actually don't have an electric signal that goes from one compartment to another. But sooner or later, you have to fall back on some form of electric component in order to get the job done. And all of those electric components are susceptible to an EMP problem.
And with all these other electrical components, is there a possibility of, because it's possibly more networked as well, is there a possibility of using electronic warfare or possibly like doing something to throw off these guidance systems, or like the GPS spoofing? Is that like, I guess we'll talk a little bit about GPS jamming, but if it's reliant on these systems, is there a risk then that somebody could like hack into it, or in some ways, just as a matter of speaking, get it to go somewhere else?
There's two approaches to mainland ICBMs and the way that they're utilized and launched, and then of course there's another approach to an SSBM, or a submarine launched subsurface ballistic missile. As you've had a guest before say that if it has anything to do with a computer, it's hackable. Absolutely. Mainland ICBMs that are in silos, if you possess enough knowledge, you can absolutely, potentially hack into that system. That system that we have in America in the 60s was initially developed with the old Unix operating system. It's an open source system, like what you may see today, like Sun Microsystems or Linux or something of that nature. An open source software system is where everybody knows exactly how to write the code and develop programs for it. Over the years, that has been updated and it's far more secure than it was in the 60s, obviously. But if it has a computer attached to it, to a network, then there is a potential that somebody can actually gain access to it, unauthorized access to it, and do things that were never intended to be done with it.
While we're on the topic, we might as well share a bit more about your theory of potentially intercepting incoming ICBMs, because they're very hard to actually hit. Like, it's very hard to hit a ICBM that's traveling at what, like 20,000 miles an hour or something with another anti-ballistic missile. Perhaps you can tell us a bit about your findings about that, but you also have this idea that they might detonate EMPs, or detonate like intercept an incoming ICBM with a nuclear explosion that will maybe not hit it directly, but the EMP field will fry the incoming ICBM. Do you actually think that's a feasible method of defense?
It's feasible in a sense that it gets us halfway there. I don't think that there's really anything that we are aware of today that is a sure shot that's going to guarantee that you're going to knock out every incoming ICBM. But the way that this theory works, according to the higher ups, is if you detonate a large enough nuclear device, what's called a HEMP, high altitude electromagnetic pulse, and we're generally talking in the range of the megaton range. We're not talking about the kiloton range. It will develop a large enough EMP pulse, electromagnetic pulse, that it will send out up to about 250,000 volts of electromagnetic energy. And this energy, when it encompasses the outside of an all steel or all metal, all aluminum, titanium missile, it generally acts as a Faraday cage. However, there are certain things with modern day ICBMs that prevent this from being an all or nothing kind of situation. Certain antennas, whether they be internal or external, Some navigation systems on some of the older ICBMs, and for all I know, they may still be in use today by Soviet bloc countries. They used digital cameras on the outside of them to compare star charts so that they could actually look into space, understand where they were relevant to where they left the Earth, where they're at right now, and correct themselves so that they could impact the target where they need to be. All of these things operate on some form of electricity. Microcircuits usually operate on microvolts or millivolts. And if you introduce that level of electromagnetic force to any one of those components, you can turn it to molten slag in the same sense that a conventional fuse, when it becomes overloaded, you push it beyond its physical threshold where it can no longer hold its bonds. The fuse element can no longer hold its bonds, and it literally melts and falls apart. And that's the exact same thing that can happen whenever electromagnetic energy encompasses something. EMP coupling occurs when that certain amount of electric current attaches to a circuit, and that is called a victim circuit now. That victim circuit, if it operates on microvolts or millivolts, it would obviously become extremely damaged or completely destroyed when that much power is forced through it. And you've got to keep in mind that this power, this electric force that's working on these circuits is monumental. 250,000 volts compared to something that would maybe normally operate on 1/100th of a volt. Transistors, electrolytic capacitors, they all explode. The small lines on circuit boards, they have a certain tolerance. Those lines can become overwhelmed with enough electric current that they literally burn up. They literally turn to a vapor, rendering whatever that component is a part of, rendering that entire system completely useless.
So would this prevent the nuke from detonating, or would it just prevent it from detonating in its intended location?
It can have a varying set of consequences. Again, as you pointed out earlier, there are different stages to the use of an ICBM. Of course, you can have pre-launch coordinates. In other words, this missile in this silo is always pointed at Washington, D.C. We know exactly where we're going to shoot it at. Essentially, for the lack of a long, drawn-out explanation, they hit the button, it goes into the atmosphere, and it flies towards its target. Well, when it gets there, when it gets to above the atmosphere, there's a lot of things that actually go on. After the initial or even secondary or third booster stage is completed, and this warhead is now starting to point itself towards mainland countries, there are certain commands that have to come from various different electronic components of that missile in order for it to do its job. Some of these commands are to do with terrain mapping, GPS signals, even your basic, longitude, latitude. If you rely on something that archaic by today's standards, but all of these things factor in to be able to just point the missile in the right direction. That doesn't include such things as whenever that particular MIRV or multiple independently targeted reentry vehicle gets to a certain point in the atmosphere where either the radio altimeter or the barometric altimeter senses that it's at a specific altitude, and it says we need to give the pre-arm command to the bomb. And then a little bit further, as this warhead starts to come down even further, it's going to give the arm command to the bomb. And what it's doing is it's preventing this bomb from going off at the wrong time or beforehand. It's also preventing the unintentional detonation of this bomb before it's supposed to go off. There's about 100 different steps that have to actually take place before a nuclear weapon is actually detonated. And if you can compromise the integrity of any one of those systems, you can reduce the lethality of that bomb. You can reduce the lethality in respect to how accurate it is, whether or not it goes off at all. Imagine just being able to interfere with the tracking and navigational systems on that warhead enough to where you throw it just a few miles off course. The difference in the lives saved versus a bomb hitting a direct large city versus outlying suburbia or maybe even out in the countryside. While it's not an all or nothing and it's not a guarantee, what it does is it weakens certain links in the chain in the hopes that you can minimize the effect of what happens. That's on the short side of it.
That's a great explanation. And sometimes it takes a person who's not a rocket scientist by trade to explain things so incredibly easy to understand and simply. So I appreciate that. Maybe you could talk a little bit about this Reagan Star Wars program. What was that? Do you think that it wasn't fully scrapped? They say it was scrapped, but maybe it merged into something else. Can you talk a little bit about space-based interceptor projects? And I know that Elon Musk SpaceX recently got a Pentagon award for tracking missile satellites. So, you know, we know that Mr. Musk is not only, this is why I think he has a first-class ticket on Air Force One, because SpaceX is integral, at least it appears anyways, towards the military's future anyways, plans on doing any sort of defense against nuclear weapons. What can you tell us about the Reagan Star Wars program, and do you think it was or it is still continuing in some form?
Again, kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier about people having a preconceived idea and that idea not actually maturing past a certain point. The Star Wars initiative started off as exactly that. He wanted to give everybody the idea that there would be some form of a mobile platform somewhere in low Earth orbit that would shoot down incoming missiles. And while that is a fairly accurate idea of what they wanted to purvey, it's a gross oversimplification of what they were getting at. Absolutely, you can put a platform in space that's armed with an interceptor missile to try to shoot down an incoming missile. But again, trying to hit a bullet with another bullet that may be operating at anywhere between Mach 5 and Mach 20 with another missile also operating at that kind of speed. It's a long shot, if you'll excuse the pun. And I mean, if you could manage to do just 1 out of 100, that would be a phenomenal interception rate. So
this idea that we have an effective anti-ballistic missile defense and that it's going to be able to take the majority of ICBMs out if they're blowing their entire load is wishful thinking at best.
For the most part, yes. Absolutely. Especially if you rely on anything that is either land or sea launched, or even if you rely on something that's air launched. We have a problem here on Earth. It's called gravity. And anything that you launch from sea or air or land, it has to have enough thrust to overcome that gravity as it accelerates towards its target. And this takes critical minutes off of your flight time to be able to intercept an incoming ICBM at any appreciable range or distance to do any good. By the time you get a B-52 in the air and you launch an interceptor missile, and it even has a moderate range of about 1,600 miles, which kind of covers the continental U.S., you're still having to launch that missile towards outer space somewhere. There's a certain amount of time that it takes to get from either on a SAC ready, which means, constant overwatch, launch the missile, flight time of that missile, and then you hope that it's accurate enough to explode somewhere within proximity to an incoming ICBM to either have the nuclear payload obliterate the incoming ICBM or the EMP payload has an effect on the missile. It's actually a kind of a long shot. We still employ it, but it's kind of it's one of those things where if you view every problem as a nail, then every solution is the hammer. It's one of the only few tools that we have in our box as far as missile defense in a conventional way that most people understand. Star Wars started off that way, but it has progressed to something a lot bigger, a lot deeper, and unfortunately quite a bit more sinister than what it started off with.
Well, of course, we have to ask, what is that sinister component of this? Because if we presume then that these things are largely ineffective, there must be another level to this. And this, of course, is why we have you here today to talk about, well, what is that other dimension to missile defense?
Okay. Russia, China, and America, we've had directed energy weapons for years. In their infancy, they weren't very effective at all. We didn't have the computer technology to test them, monitor them, control them to any appreciable amount. They were not efficient. And even though we could achieve certain results, we weren't close enough to actually making it a feasible weapon system. That's changed. And we actually now have the capability to utilize a directed electromagnetic array. And we can project an array of that energy through our atmosphere all the way to outer space in order to be able to track up to 500 satellites or missiles at one time. And the way this technology works is somewhat similar to the old radar. The old radar would emit a pulse of energy, and the target would reflect a certain amount of that energy back. It's very similar to sonar. And we would say, okay, in that direction, at that azimuth, there is a target there. We understand there's a target there. EM radar works a little differently. Not only can it energize that target, and if it's a conventional airplane that's not stealth technology equipped, we can see it. Shows up like a big bright sun on a screen. However, even if it has limited stealth technology, what happens is that electromagnetic energy goes to that object and it alters the electromagnetic field around it to some degree. And the receiving antenna on a phased array antenna that's very high powered, it can actually detect the anomalies of the electromagnetic field around that item. And that's the reason that whenever Russia started developing its S-400 and S-500 and S-550 program, you notice we suddenly didn't use first generation stealth technology F-117 fighters anymore.
They became obsolete.
It became obsolete. That somebody developed another set of radar technology that says, okay, we can see it. It may not have the same radar cross section that a B-52 does on conventional radar, but they can still see it. And if they can see it, they can shoot at it. It's real simple.
So this DO technology that you're saying, would these be ground-based, for lack of better terms, laser weapons?
Well, they're not laser weapons. They are ground-based, or I should say surface-based. Are you familiar with Aegis technology that's used on things like the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer or Aegis cruisers?
I'd like you to fill me in. I'm familiar with the term. I know you've mentioned it to me in some emails, but perhaps you can elaborate.
Okay. Essentially, what it is a huge electromagnetic force emitter. Now, these warships or these huge radar arrays, which is a twin or a phased radar array, has two antennas on it. One is a transmitter, and one is a receiver. Okay, that's how it transmits the information, the energy, and then depending on what the energy does at or near the target, it receives a certain signal back, and they can interpolate it however they need to in order to determine flight characteristics, whether it's a threat, so forth and so on. Okay, the same technology is used in Aegis in order to project this electromagnetic energy out to a target. And because most cruise missiles, aircraft, and things of that nature that are launched from the surface to the surface, or even from the air to the surface, they're not EMP hardened at all. There's no need for them to be. And this electromagnetic energy latches on to these weapon systems through that coupling process that I was telling you about. This electromagnetic energy can damage or destroy critical guidance components. It can also, even if it's far away, it can negatively affect the avionics of that particular missile system. And a miss is a miss, whether it's by a few hundred feet or a couple of 100 miles. And if you can confuse the missile to such a degree that it does not contact your ship and explode, you've achieved essentially a soft kill of that missile. If you can confuse it, if you can render certain portions of it incapable of fulfilling its mission, maybe it falls into the sea. It's still considered a soft kill. You've protected your asset from an incoming threat. And that's exactly the same way that the high power phased array works whenever it's tracking satellites and ICBMs.
And so how many, like, would you say that we have sufficient systems then that this has now replaced the actual missile defense strategy? And are you saying that they've somehow brought this technology into space?
Well, electromagnetic force or radio frequency travels at the speed of light in open space where there's nothing there to inhibit it. And if there's nothing there to inhibit it, once it goes out in a direction, it just keeps on going. Just like a coronal mass from the sun keeps on coming towards the Earth until it impacts the Earth. And it travels at the speed of light. Now, this is somewhat slowed down here within the atmosphere of the Earth, which is why they have to have huge transmitters in order to push that radio frequency signal through the atmosphere. But with enough power, you can push that signal through the atmosphere into space in order to track your satellites and your ICBMs and things of that nature.
Okay.
It requires this huge amount of power in order to have the end result. You can detect something with a radar array that's low power, but it's not going to have the anomalous effect on the missile system or on the satellite that you might expect a high-powered electromagnetic wave to have that same effect.
So is it possible to put something in space that has enough power to do it?
It would have to be so huge that it would show up on everybody's radar, if you'll excuse the pun. Whenever we're talking about something that's shipborne, it probably has a total irradiated output of maybe 1 megawatt. 1 megawatt is equivalent to 1,000 kilowatts. Okay, and it would have to use a lot of the energy derived from the generators located on the ship. That's actually considered a low power system. The system itself would have to have something upwards of 30 to 40 megawatts, if not bigger. In fact, two of the biggest radar systems that I'm talking about, one of them is located in Florida and the other one is located in the Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. It has its own 30-something megawatt power generation plant that's just a mile or two from it. So in order to be able to utilize this, you have to have the power to run it, which makes it impractical for something space-based.
Unless it was like some secret nuclear power station up there or something, which would be unfeasible, at least for the time being. Because if they had this technology, I mean, the point of nuclear deterrence is to broadcast that you have a deterrent to discourage your adversary from using it. If the point was deterrence and not protecting against some sort of preemptive strike or first strike. Now, you said the word sinister before. Could you explain what you mean by that? Why is it sinister?
Well, electromagnetic energy has different effects on different particles of matter depending on how you utilize it. Some electromagnetic energy at certain frequencies will interact with things that are based off of water or carbon or essentially life forms. Other things you may have to adjust the frequency at which it operates in order to have a different effect on different things. So while they may be able to essentially oscillate or change the frequency to detect, let's say, an airplane or a missile that's incoming, if you change the frequency, the wavelength of that emitted power, you can just as easily negatively affect anything that happens to be within that radar energy array's purview. So let's say you have a 1.4 to 1.8 degree arc that this energy projection is going out of. You tune it to the specific frequency that, let's say, 2.4 gigahertz. That's what your microwave oven operates at. If you your microwave oven operates between 600 watts and maybe 1,200 watts. That's it. So if you tune this, essentially, it's called an interferometer. It interferes with waves, energy waves. Okay. If you tune this to operate at, let's say, 2.4 gigahertz, but you do it at 30 megawatts, imagine what kind of effect it would have on a pilot or a crew member in an airplane at 30 megawatts versus your 600 to 1200 watts of your typical homeowner microwave oven. And the thing that makes the microwave oven safe for us to use in our homes is the metal case around the microwave oven and the little metal mesh grate that's located in the door. That acts as a Faraday cage to keep all of that EMF concentrated towards whatever it is that you're heating up in the microwave. If you remove that outer shell, that outer metal shell of the microwave oven, or you remove that door, that energy can actually be projected out into the room. The original name for the microwave oven was actually called the radar range.
Jeez. Thank
Did you
God.
not?
Thank God for the Faraday
called
cage.
the radar range, and it operates on the exact same principle. Projected energy that is reflected back, and then you get to see what happens depending on how your receiving antenna is attuned, whether or not you're looking for simply reflected energy, or if you're looking for electromagnetic anomalies in the atmosphere. And that same technology, you don't just have to shoot something in the sky. You could take any one of these radar arrays and point it at somebody on the ground and essentially do the same thing. And you could point it at a tank. And while it may not have a whole lot of effect on the metal skin of the tank, because of the ports and the holes and the things in the tank, you would have these barrier breaching anomalies that would happen, and anybody inside that tank would suddenly become goo.
Well, I think I've seen it mounted on a large plane. Don't they have it mounted on a large military plane?
Sure. Its antenna is going to look a little different, but they've got it mounted on a large plane. There's even a version of it that's used by the U.S. Army. It's called the active denial system.
Right. I've seen that. They use it for riot control too, I think.
Absolutely. And what makes that safe for their intended usage is, rather than projecting that electromagnetic energy at a lower frequency that would interact with the water deep within our bodies, which would be about 2.4, 2.5 gigahertz, that particular system operates at 95 gigahertz, which whenever you increase that, the frequency or the wavelength of it, you actually decrease its ability to penetrate something. Okay, so this is why something at 2.4 gigahertz heats up the entirety of your mashed potatoes in your microwave oven, whereas something operating at 95 gigahertz with the same amount of power would probably only affect the most outer parts of that bowl of mashed potatoes, maybe a 64th of an inch, roughly 5 thousandths of an inch. So
I was going to say, we're going to get all kinds of comments about Havana syndrome.
oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's going to run wild.
Yeah. And so this is perhaps somewhat adjacent to that. So if we have this technology, then is this what they're going to use, do you think? And how in place do you think these systems are? Like, are we at a point now where we have adequate amounts of these systems to protect against a full-blown Russian attack and a Chinese attack?
No. The Star Wars system, of course, it lost its public appeal, and it lost a huge amount of its funding. There's a term in the government for things that are funded behind back channels. It's called black funding, because if you draw a reference to a black budget, okay, a certain amount of these things are black funded, but that doesn't mean that they were completely taken off the table. They were researched, developed, and put into place with a certain amount of money that was essentially written off and lost in a paper trail somewhere. Now, one of these weapon systems, these radars that I'm talking about, that's located in the Kwajalein Atoll, is actually called the Ronald Reagan Missile Defense Test Site. You really think that's a coincidence?
That's in the Marshall Islands?
That's in the Marshall Islands. Now, if you were going to put something somewhere that could detect Russian satellites, Russian incoming missiles, and with the potential to have some kind of effect on them, where would you want to put it?
Well, I'm assuming, well, I guess it depends, but you're suggesting in the Pacific somewhere?
And lo and behold, if you go look in the Pacific, you'll find that that's exactly where the Marshall Islands are at. And not only does it work for Russian threats, it also happens to work for Chinese threats or North Korean threats or
But wouldn't the
anything.
Russians launch over the poles?
They can. See, if you look at a Moldita type of map where you're looking from the top down, right? Certain portions of Russia are directly opposite of us, and those missiles that were launched from that area would actually go over the North Pole. However, certain portions of eastern Russia are actually closer to Alaska, and a certain amount of those missiles may actually fly over the northern section of the Pacific Ocean, where this system could potentially see it.
And I guess if we're talking about China as well, they would launch over the Pacific?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, especially like North Korea. That would be one of their easiest avenues of approach. It would just depend where it's launched from uh, in that particular country. Well, depending on what flight path it takes, it could take its flight path could take it over the northern pole, or it could take it somewhere across the Pacific Ocean. It just depends on where it's launched from.
And then North Korea as well. Somebody sent me a message about the Marshall Islands radioactivity NOTAMs that was, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but that was sent out, I think, couple weeks ago now. And then I'm not sure if you've seen it, but there was this, I don't know if it was a tsunami or there was some kind of storm there recently, and they're trying to connect some dots between those two things. Do you have any thoughts on the NOTAMs, or whatever it's called, the Notice to Airmen, that was sent out from the Marshall Islands in that region, and how it might relate to what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think I can. If I'm interpreting what they're saying correctly, let me take a step back in technology. Let's go back to the late 70s and early 80s. Let's talk about an installation in Alaska called HAARP, the High Altitude Auroral Research Project.
I was hoping you'd go to HAARP.
Right? Well, essentially, what that is a huge auroral manipulation device through a huge array of antennas. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of it or not, but it's just these antennas all over the place. They project a certain amount of electromagnetic energy into the ionosphere. And what this does to the ionosphere is it actually bends it, it warps it. If you'll imagine a parabolic reflector like a satellite dish, and if you bend it and change the angle, you actually change how it reflects a signal coming into its collector on the collector comb. Okay. Now, if you take this same electromagnetic energy and it's called pumping. Whenever you pump the ionosphere full of this energy, you can actually make that particular part of the ionosphere more dense. We all know that more dense an object, the easier it is to ricochet or bounce something off of it. This EM energy can be shot towards the ionosphere, and through some people refer to it as skip. Like if you've ever gotten a radio signal from thousands of miles away and you've been able to hear it, that's essentially what's happening. It's the same thing. This energy is projected towards the ionosphere. The ionosphere reflects it from the sine angle and back down towards a different location, and you may be able to pick up a radio signal from somewhere completely across the earth. And if somebody wanted to interfere with a radio signal, or interfere with GPS, or interfere with anything that has a potential to receive radio frequency interference, RFI, you can shoot that energy towards the ionosphere, charge it, then shoot the specifically tuned bolt of energy, essentially, refract it off of that bent ionosphere and affect somebody else's position and ability on the other side of the earth from monitoring you. Again, it's EM energy, and it can couple to any number of things. They can actually damage or destroy surveillance equipment. You can actually interfere with the avionics on airplanes flying in an area across the world. It just depends on how you manipulate two very important things on whatever's transmitting this EM energy. Okay, you have the frequency at which it's transmitted, which would have to be matched up to whatever your target is. And of course, you have to have the strength, the amplitude. So you modulate the amplitude and you modulate the frequency. You could essentially tune an EMF transmitter to affect anything on the God's green earth and things in outer space too. It just depends on how much energy you can afford to project at that particular direction.
And so you're saying that the purpose of HAARP then is strategic in nature. It is not for whatever research purposes, or that's your hypothesis, is that you think that it's for the purpose of nuclear war and intercepting the Russians, basically.
I'm not real sure. I'm convinced that's its only purpose. Another side effect, if you will, of pumping into the ionosphere. I want you to envision a glass of water. Under normal conditions, let's call that almost clear glass of water the ionosphere. The ionosphere plays a huge role in our communications because our communication signals go through this ionosphere. Just as we look through that clear glass of water, our radio signals can go freely enough through this clear glass of water. Now, if you harden that ionosphere by pumping it and making it more dense with electrons, you inhibit radio frequency signals from going through it. So if I wanted to be able to keep somebody from communicating with somebody through the ionosphere, if I wanted to be able to cut somebody off from being able to bounce a signal from one satellite through one side of the ionosphere, completely through the ionosphere, out the other side of the ionosphere to another satellite on the other side of the Earth, it'd be the quickest and easiest way to blind a satellite. So there are a lot of implications to this electronic warfare that actually go on. And
So
I
it
don't
could
know
be
if it was
used to
specifically
intercept.
designed for that, but that's the overall gist of it. And if that glass of water, if you drop just one drop of food coloring in it and it becomes somewhat cloudy, it's harder to see through, right? So the same thing happens. The more you charge the ionosphere, the more chance that you have of inhibiting or even stopping uh, an electronic signal from going through it. Your radio frequency energy gets inhibited.
So you're saying that this would be used to interfere with the command and control systems of, getting the Russians the capability to communicate with their launch platforms, their nuclear triad. Would this be utilized in that way?
It can very well be used in that way. Again, ICBMs, just about every aspect of modern day warfare rely on some form of microwave or GPS technology. It's usually very low power, maybe 10 watts. But everything from the individual soldier all the way up to our ability to launch a missile, track its location, and put it on target relies on our network of satellites. These satellites rely on radio frequency energy, microwave transmissions from everything from that's on the surface to other satellites that are somewhere out there in close Earth orbit. And if you inhibit those satellites' abilities to communicate with each other, you may be able to cause that missile to fly a couple of miles off target. That airplane, and this is a while ago, you mentioned the word spoofing. GPS spoofing occurs when the accelerometers in airplanes or missiles cause the missile to think that it's in one spot, but it's actually not there because it hasn't updated with the satellite to actually track it. So it thinks that it's going in a specific direction at a specific speed for a specific amount of time. And just like your TomTom or your GPS tracker in your car or your phone says, turn right now. Well, if that missile is actually off course, it doesn't know it. And the same thing can be said with tracking that missile and being able to bring that missile back on course. If it doesn't know where it's at, it cannot figure out where it needs to be. So if you interfere with the ability of the missile or the weapon system from communicating with the satellite, they can't shake hands. So the accuracy of your system, the overall efficacy of your systems, they go down. It's not to say that they're completely destroyed, but you greatly inhibit their ability to wage a productive war.
Do you think that the Russians have something similar to HARP? Do the Chinese or any other country have a similar system?
I know Russia was fooling around with the technology in the 70s and the 80s. There is a man, U.S. Navy Admiral Tom, can't remember his last name. He actually did a study on it. It came out in 1984, and I can even direct you to where you can obtain a copy of this. But he actually did a study, a quite extensive study on what Russia was doing with their version of the same thing, their version of a directed energy weapon. They couldn't get it to work. They couldn't get it to work nearly as well as we did. It's actually their main facility is located in the mountainous, craggy, rocky regions of the Novaya Zemlya, which is north of Russia, out in the middle of the ocean. It's the same island where they detonated the Tsar Bomba. It is an exclusion zone, meaning because of the radiation, nobody is supposed to be there. So it's a perfect cover in order to put a military base to do some, background undercover theoretical science without anybody bothering you.
Well, you'd think if this actually worked, and I mean, HARP's been around for a long time, you think if it actually worked, they would have figured it out by now, or they would be utilizing it more if it was an integral part of our defense.
We do. We just don't have the means by which to put it out in front of the public. The people, I hate to quote a movie, but to quote Tommy Lee Jones in Men in Black, he talks about, there's always a Carillion death ray, there's always a certain destroyer or whatnot, and the only reason that people on this pathetic, miserable little planet go on about their daily lives is because they do not know about it. And if the general people actually understood what was really going on, they would literally be up in arms. You can't put a huge radar complex on every block and somebody not take notice of it. And these complexes cost billions of dollars with a B. They're not cheap. So just throwing them out here and there, that's completely off the table. And after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia lost a huge amount of its research and development funding to continue these programs. I don't know exactly where they're at with their particular research. I can tell you that we're ahead of them in this regard. At the time, we may have been peer or near peer, but I can tell you as of 1991, they had to abandon a lot of their programs like that. They understand it. They employ it too today. It's just not on any kind of a level that we can, because we have a GNP that says we can afford frivolous things, and that's exactly what happens.
And so is this why the Russians rely on more analog technology in their equipment?
Russians, yes and no. They have a very limited budget compared to the West. But the reason Russia relies heavily upon an analog approach is because most of their military is comprised of partisans or conscripts. And it's a lot easier to teach a troop how to operate a more simplistic tank or airplane or weapons system in a couple of months than it does to take us millions of dollars to teach a fighter pilot how to fly an F-16 or an F-15 or an F-22. The average Russian spends less than 2 years in their army. They learn just enough to be able to salute, know how to recognize rank, and shoot an AK-47 for the most part. They're hardliners. They may stay in for years or decades, but their tanks are more simplistic, both in design and operation. Their airplanes are more simplistic in both design and operation. And that's where that comes from.
And that can be advantageous in terms of the reusability and just the durability in the field, right?
It can be. And they've followed this protocol for decades. Joseph Stalin was once quoted as saying that quantity has a quality all its own. And what he's referring to is while they may not build the most robust weapon system, they can build 10 times as many as the enemy can. And even in the hands of a poorly trained conscript, even a mediocre weapon system can still be effective if you have 10 times as many as your enemy. And that's exactly where they're at even today. Give you an example. The MiG-29 Fulcrum airplane pretty much debuted in the late 80s and early 90s. It's still considered one of their most prolific airplanes today, but we've surpassed it leaps and bounds. The T-72 tank came out in the late 60s, was put into service in 1972. They still have an updated version of it still going today. And what a lot of people don't realize is Russia will take something that's old, modify it just a little bit, and give it a completely new name. The Russian T-72B3 is really nothing more than an update, and they gave it a new name. They called it the T-90A for advanced. And then as the years go on, they give it another little advance or another form of modernization. But really, the weapon systems are still archaic compared to what we have today. They just produce 10 times as many of them.
And they don't have as much maintenance, which is a problem right now in Ukraine, right? Because they have to keep sending the things back to Poland to be repaired and stuff.
That's a problem for a lot of Western countries. Maintenance and logistics. There's an old saying, amateurs practice tactics and professionals practice logistics. The old way of thinking in the Cold War, they didn't bother fixing the tank. They cast it aside and put the crew into another tank if the crew happened to survive. They didn't really worry so much about logistics. They literally viewed pretty much everything that they had as a throwaway doctrine. I mean, you see it today in Ukraine. They treat people with the same respect. They just keep throwing a wall of meat into the enemy because they're expendable. It's an asset that they have lots of. They're not interested in crew survivability of their weapon systems at all. They don't care, because for every soldier that dies, there's 2 or 3 waiting back at base to take their place. So one strategically placed EMP device has the potential to take out an innumerable amount of satellites on any one side of the planet.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.